I'll ask for general questions for openers, either based on the assignment, or I also took it that Alia had a retroactive or retrograde question, which we can entertain too. So, any questions? Waltraud's question is more generally is, what is the relevance of this material to the whole picture?
Mine is sort of related to that, which is to ask sort of, do you have any advice kind of how to see this in relation for someone who hasn't thought about math or logic in this way, or geometry really at all since high school? Just kind of how to see this in relation to the stuff we were doing last semester.
Okay.
I don't really know how to orient myself towards it.
Yeah.
Because it's so foreign. All the numbers,
right,
letters, and shapes are so foreign to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to just even know how to read it, or it's kind of a tough question, maybe.
Okay. Well, right. I think I understand the question. It's not unrelated to the earlier question. Let me hold it because I'm going to try and do that probably as we get into the material itself. Are there any other questions, general or specific?
I think I'd rather go on than back up.
Okay.
And if I want to back up later,
Yeah.
I want to understand that circle with the square in it thing more.
Okay.
It looks like there's a mild hope that I could understand it. But I think I'd rather not back up to do
Okay,
that.
because I think it actually will
And
come up
maybe-
again.
Good.
I think it comes up again, and the book will kind of take us back to it.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I have one question that's a little different from others. It's sort
Okay.
of internal to it. In Faith and Philosophy, you give a fairly sharp derivation of the three numbers as the not nothing, the not nothing, and the not
Right.
nothing. Now, normally, negation is a main operator in the logic,
Mm-hmm.
and the claim is that this is a new logic
Mm-hmm.
in which there is no nothing, and
Right.
therefore no inequality, so therefore no negation, or it seems like there would be no negation.
Mm-hmm.
And yet in this original derivation, you do it all through negation. Not nothing, not nothing.
Right.
So my question is, actually, you could go
Right.
anywhere you want with that, but my literal question is the absence of inequality and the absence of nothing to be taken as the absence of the logical operator, negation?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, how do you explain the fact that you use it
All
anyway?
those knots.
Yeah.
Okay. This came up, I think, tangentially, maybe last semester or the time before that. It seemed to me I was talking to Adam about this, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But it doesn't make any difference. The answer, the short answer, the quick to the cut to the chase type answer is that the knots there are not operating as negations in the
Classical sense.
because if they were, then not nothing followed by not nothing would return us.
Okay.
Okay, we return us to nothing. In other words, a double negation is an affirmative,
yes,
right?
no-
Okay, but here a double negation is not an affirmative. So my answer to you, a little more positively, is that the knots are functioning not so much as negations, but as indices of differentiation. Right? In other words, this is not that without. Right? That is. So I might read this is different than that. Right?
Okay. Now, there's two ways to go there.
Okay.
That in Hegelian logic,
Right.
that's precisely the way negation functions.
Yes. I understand that. Yeah.
Whereas in intuitionist logic,
Right.
in which the double negation elimination is is not there.
Mhm.
For instance, you don't have the negative of a negative is a return
positive,
of a positive. But you have the way it's expressed is the absurdity of the absurdity of. In other words, a given proposition,
Mhm.
and then the way it's negated is the absurdity of that proposition. But the absurdity of an absurd proposition is not the initial proposition.
Mhm.
But that's not what it is either.
No, I don't think so.
But
I
it's
think
more like the Hegelian one, or the aspect of the Hegelian one which is different from classical logic, but is taken as pure differentiation.
The negation is just to. It's probably not a negation, right? In other words, it may be a limitations of my semantic choice there. In other words,
Okay.
if I had anticipated the objection, I might have
Done it differently.
done it differently. But I understand by that. In other words, so the not the last one, the not nothing. Okay, is a moving along. It's not in no sense is it.
A return. Oh, I understand
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just a way of differentiating.
Of marking the distinction.
Yeah, of marking the distinctions. And the first not nothing, which is fundamental, and in the context of faith and philosophy particularly, is related, I think, to Descartes' use of such a notion. He actually takes some metaphysical solace, if I could put it that way, in the meditations that he is not nothing, right? Right? By which he means something quite positive and affirmative. So in that kind of spirit that is lost, and the other thing I'm doing in faith and philosophy is showing how Hegel really has no patience with the little Cartesian not nothing, right? In other words, so Hegel does violence to Descartes' rather careful, really affirmation of his finitude.
The only point is that the context of his doing that isn't the context of constructing a logic.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand it. But I'm saying analogously to the affirmative intention of Descartes in the meditation, analogous to that, the first step in the logic is a not nothing. It is a something positive, all right? And is the not there is just to say that it is not nothing. It is something.
We need to.
So I might say some. I don't like this, but I mean just to be clear, trying to be clear. I could have say the first moment is something. The second moment is another something, and the third moment is yet another something. That's the result I'm looking for.
But it doesn't get your mind to actually gain the insight. The way
Perhaps.
the
Perhaps.
negations
Yes, right.
actually help.
Yeah, because you have to sort through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And well, just quick, and then I'll
Okay.
leave this.
Well, it's very relevant actually to where we're going to start, because I don't know if you look at the syllabus, we're really going to start at the end of the book.
Yeah.
We're going to start with the Trinity. Yeah.
There is this man, G. Spencer Brown, which.
Oh, have I heard of G. Spencer Brown? My friend Steve Hoth started out as a disciple of Brown. I think I've conquered that. But anyway, go on.
Well, okay, but the point is that it's just following through on these refinement on this thing, because definitely there you have a logic of distinction, which is not based on negation.
Okay.
So it would be just a question to you whether the refinement there is operative. I wouldn't think that you would buy into Spencer Brown, but still there would be a refinement of the distinction. That should.
All right, that's perhaps true.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any other comments for openers? If not, let's take a look at the appendix, which I think explains itself as something written relatively afterwards to the logic. On page 329,
629.
I'm sorry, 629. 629. I kind of date the logic 1985. And then, or maybe I'll read through this because it may give a preliminary answer to the questions that I'm getting at the end of the table. As has been made clear in the text, powerful conceptual motives were at work in the understanding and elaboration of this logic of the beginning. The central notion was that no nothing was to have a place in the logic of the essentially new consciousness. The working out of the implications of the logic led immediately to the discovery of the essentially mathematical reading possible when dealing with the Hebrew and Greek languages. Now that's a little, and then the chapters are footnoted there, but and so when I put the book together, as is the implication of the footnotes, I rearranged the order. So the sequence that we're dealing in the book with the material is not the straight historical sequence of the discovery material, right? So what we're going to do, what we're going to start to do next time, that chapter, which has the Hebrew in it with the mathematics, that actually followed much more immediately, historically, upon the logical chapter, 3.1. And the stuff that we're doing today comes next, right? So, oh no, it actually doesn't come next, it comes last. Because then after the discovery that the Hebrew and Greek, the mathematics of the Hebrew and Greek, in a methodology hitherto non-existent, in other words, a methodology that coincides the thinking now occurring, that the Hebrew and Greek languages have a conceptual intelligibility parallel to the mathematical reading. Following that, this in turn led to the discovery of new fundamental properties of the natural number system. Now that's already come up, but we didn't touch on it because we skipped a lot of stuff. We were rushing last time, but we're going to have to inevitably get back to it. But in the latter part of our last assignment, where I do the Fibonacci sequence related to the logical template, that infinite lattice work of zeros, unums, and ones, when I superimpose the Fibonacci sequence, which is a whole number analog or equivalent, analog probably a better term, approximation in a better term, of the geometric series where x equals the golden section, that whole number analog of the geometric series where x equals the golden section, the Fibonacci series, superimposed on the logic, and then put in a 10 by 10 grid, right, the first 100 numbers of that sequence, actually produces in the ultimate little cornerstone, and the ultimate 3 by 3 box down in the bottom of that, produces a number that approximates 8.2944 times 10 to the 36th. The significance of that being that 82944 was discovered to be, along with 784, to have properties, unique properties that were shared only with the number 1. All right, so they 1, 784, and 82944. And there's a little chapter which is coming up later on. We'll look at it a little more closely. But what I'm saying is, in other words, that number is already appearing. We've already encountered it. We didn't dwell on it. We didn't focus on it. And that discovery, the discovery that there are these 3 unique numbers in the natural number system, that was a consequence of applying to pure numbers the technique that I developed in dealing with the Hebrew and the Greek qua numbers, right? So in other words, in dealing with any given word or sentence in, let's say, Hebrew, and interpreting each letter in terms of its ancient historical, mathematical value, and then manipulating that in a methodology which, as I say, is new to the thinking now, with the thinking now occurring. I applied that same kind of methodology. I thought to myself, well, I'm doing this with the language, and it's producing interesting results. Why don't I try this just on numbers, pure numbers? Forget the language a moment. Let's see what happens. Go back, again, a kind of partial answer to the question that you share with Adam. A lot of the thinking now occurring, as you may have noticed on a purely conceptual basis, is experiment. It's experiment. It's discovery, right? So I then performed an experiment on natural numbers to see if it produced any interesting results like I had discovered in applying the methodology to the language. And sure enough, these numbers came up. all right, as unique in the. Now I had not being a mathematician, which I've said, right. When I proved that there were only these three numbers, I didn't prove it elegantly like a mathematician would. It's been subsequently proved, by the way, by a couple of mathematicians, because I ran into a Canadian mathematician who was editing a problem section in a mathematical magazine, and he said, "Do you mind if could I use that?" And, right? Okay. So he put out one of the three numbers, one of the two numbers other than one, and he asked if anybody could produce the other number, right? And sure enough, he got several mathematicians to respond the following month, or whatever the next issue was, and these guys could, 10 lines of mathematical notation prove that these are the only three numbers that have this property, whereas it took me weeks, if not months, to devise a computer program to prove it. Now, I could only do that because I was able to figure out, mathematician or no mathematician, I could figure out that it wasn't a waste of time. In other words, that there was only a finite range between 1 and 10 to the 21st power, beyond which range these numbers, because of the nature of what made them unique, they couldn't exist beyond that range. That I could figure out. But where in the first 10 to the 21st number, I wasn't about to sit down for the next 20 years and count through all those numbers to find it. So I created.
What are their properties? Can you say simply?
The property is that. Let me take the classic one. This is the most important of the three numbers. Okay, and the property of this number that's unique to it and 784 is that this number is 8 squared times 9 squared times 4 squared. In other words, the property of these numbers is that the odd numbered numbers in the number, counting left to right, squared and multiplied into one another, or multiplied into one another and squared, produce the number. Right? So I devised the computer program, and this I had already. This one I had hit upon. I just hit upon it because I hit upon it through the Hebrew. It gets very interesting because this number appears in the Hebrew for Yahweh. We'll see. Yahweh, King of Israel. The Greek for Jesus Christus. It's great. So the Greek, the Hebrew for dead center, which you'll see a lot of the use of that term, which is 0.0 of energy. So in the language, I discovered this number in the language, in analyzing the language, and then I had this number and I had figured this property out, but what I wanted to find out was with any other. So then I had to write the computer program, knowing that there was a finite limit of possibilities, but I had no clue as to how many or what other such numbers there might be.
And so it turns out there are just those three.
That's right, there are only three. I mean, if you count one, because one squared is 1, right? So that counts. So I, just anecdotally, I create the program. You know how long it take to create the computer program, right? Weeks, months, I have no idea. Right? And of course, if you've ever done a computer program, it's not just you create a program, because then you have to keep debugging it because it never works. Okay.
But wait, I just want to say something, because people who've never had any interest in number theory.
Yeah.
Number theory is about weird properties of numbers. And there are all kinds of them. And you wouldn't normally think that the number sequence that just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and you keep adding 1, that numbers like 742, 3 would have properties. But they do. And so, really, because they have properties, the question of what the existence of the number series as part of existence itself it's a natural question. It's not an additional question and you just have this weird thing that's arithmetic and forget about it, and then there's reality. The numbers are part of reality. And so in what sense are they part of reality is part of the question of what the essence of existence is. So if one area of exploration will make it so that you can discover particular properties of the number series, that's interesting.
That's helpful.
So I do the program, right? And I was really, talk about self-indulgent. So I did the program, and then I added into the program a code which said that when you find a number that fills the bill, flash. The screen will flash. No, not stop. Well, maybe stop, but the screen would flash, right? So I'm sitting there at my desk, and I have this program running. Now you can see, I've already told you, in effect, no sooner. It wasn't, this is an old computer, not that quick, but the same day probably, or at worst the next day, very quickly, all of a sudden the screen started flashing, right? Because the other number turned out to be a very low number, 784. I let it run, of course, to prove that there were no others between. Did you say? Yeah.
Why did you just use the square? Why not go into cube and all, you know?
That's a good question. The square worked. I mean, I don't know. I mean, right. I'll leave something for somebody else to do. Right? Okay.
So just focusing
Yeah,
quick
sure.
on, for those who don't remember the mathematics, what's a natural number?
A natural number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as distinguished from 0. 0 is not a natural number, but it's an integer. So
No minus numbers.
Okay.
No fractions. No
No weird.
weird
No
numbers.
weirdness.
I have another question before
Okay.
we go on. So when you say you applied the same methodology, do you mean that thing of thinking in proportions?
yes, that's
what you
right.
mean.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Because
That's the methodology.
yes, but I'm giving you the shorthand here.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, this. When you do what I just put up here,
Yeah.
you get what I call the integral product, right? This is a product, and I call it the integral product because there is a rational product of this, right? Okay, so well, let's take 784 because that's no. Let me take 82944 because it's the most interesting number. So yes, I'm saying this: 8 is to 2 as 9 is to 4 as 1 is to, and then I bracket the implicit 1, right? In other words, in an odd numbered sequence of numbers, the last number as a ratio is the, what do we call it? The numerator, right? Or the antecedent logically.
What happens to the
So
second
if
four?
you multiply, all right, so this gives you, if you do what I just said, you get what I call the integral product. Now, if you, on the other hand, multiply the ratios as such, in other words, 8 over 2 times 9 over 4 times, what did I do here?
You left out the second 4.
Yeah, 4 over 1, right, that's what I meant. Times 4. Let's see if I can figure out, I'm trying to remember, I think the integral product is 36, does that sound right? 4 times... Oh, 4, no, yeah, sure. 4 nines. It
16
resolves to
times
4
nine,
nines.
yeah.
36. So I call that the rational product. Yeah. That really makes explicit the answer to the question, right? In other words,
Yeah.
so the rational product of this number is 36, and that's very good because when you read the Hebrew, 36 is a recurrent number in Hebrew words. I mean, the mathematical value of Hebrew words for unity. See? And if you read the logical chapter, even though we didn't stress it when we were going over it, and we'll again have a reason to go back to the logical chapter, what I call the logical chapter 3.1, you'll notice that I wind up there translating all of that logic into numbers, and the bottom line is some kind of an identification of 36 and 1/36. Okay, and what I'm saying is that the Hebrew language, analyzed according to this new methodology, all right, gives evidence of some profound, deep resonance, you see, of the number 36 with the verbal, conceptual expression of unity, unification. There are various, some of which will be in the text, right? And that's also interesting because another thing we're going to get to when we get a little beyond this kind of relatively pure mathematics, we'll get into this kind of really inventive mathematics, what I call the absolute dead center cube. And what's interesting about that is that the side of that cube, all right, the side of that cube is divisible into, you wouldn't be surprised to know, 36 squares, the area of which is the square root is 288. It's the square root of 82944. Okay. So again, this is all discovery, one step at a time. So it's just following your nose and discovering that there is a structure here. It's not something I started out with, but it's something that manifested itself as I was paying attention at each step of the way. But the reason you keep going when you get involved in this kind of insanity is that each new discovery sheds light on the past, plugs into it, so to speak. You see what I'm saying? Amplifies it, so that it's just a question of being, keeping alert and seeing the relevance of this to other things. Now, of course, it's easier said than done, and even today, there are a lot of stuff that I don't always have in mind. I have to rethink it and so on. But so this turns out to be, as I say, central. And unlike 784, this number, as we'll see it when we get to the chapter, what can I say? Its third part, if you divide by 3, its 1/3 part has an integral product which is a third of itself, so that this is the structure of this methodology in the case of this number goes right through to the 9th part of this number, right? Now, you say, well, why? What's so nice about 9? Is this mysticism? Well, no, not exactly. Because if 0 is not a natural number, even though we keep on counting from 1 on up, when we hit 10, right? And this will also justify what otherwise might appear to be a simply arbitrary squaring of the first 100 numbers. Why put it in the 10 by 10 box?
Well, why do it in decimal to begin with? The real nature of the numbers isn't confined to the decimal system, but the place values are confined to the decimal system.
Okay, but what I'm trying, I don't know whether we're talking about the same thing or not, but what I'm trying to get to is that when I hit 10, on one level I'm starting over again. I'm doing 1 through 9 again. You say only now I'm adding 0 to the 1. Right? I'm starting with 0, 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. So the 9, the significance of 9 is that
it's the 10th number.
Well, if you count 0, it's the 10th number, but it's it as opposed to the 0 that is dragged in. Okay, those 1 through 9 form the fundamental natural numbers of the decimal system of the I don't know how we're using the term of the base 10 system.
Base 10, yeah.
Right? The natural number, the pure natural numbers, right, that are used there. The natural numbers, the digits that are natural numbers are 1 through 9. The 0 is not.
You could use an X as well as a 0.
Whatever. Right. Okay.
To change the place notation.
Yeah. Okay. And it turns out, since I'm on 9 now, why 9? It turns out, again, that's something I discovered later, which is the heading of the chapter in which I recount these basic facts mathematically, is that the product of this number times this number, these two unique numbers, okay? If I can state this right. Either the product or the square of the product, it'll be there in the book somewhere, equals the first, the factorial 9, which is the first 9 numbers, 1 through 9, multiplied into itself, 1 times 2 times 3, right? Factorial 9. That divided by the sum of the first 9, which is 45. So the factorial 9 divided by 1 through 9 added together, squared, gives you the product of these unique numbers. So my conclusion is that the uniqueness of these numbers is related in a profoundly foundational, fundamental way, you see, to the base 10 system. Now, of course, when you speak to some mathematicians, like this guy at Princeton, whom I otherwise admire, his attitude, this is fairly common scientific prejudice, well, it's just a coincidence that we have 10 fingers. right? In other words, we count by tens because we have 10 fingers, but that's it. It's not significant, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's a losing argument these days.
Well, I agree with you, but I'm just saying
not just because of weird discoveries, but because of complexity theory, where the thresholds, numerical thresholds, are absolutely significant for all kinds of things.
Right.
So,
Right. And I think it's also immediately fallacious when you think of the golden section, because the golden section is admitted even by the guy who would give me this kind of response to be a universal constant, as it were, in natural structures, human and pineapples and you name it. Okay, and the golden structure mathematically is the golden section mathematically is the square root of 5 plus 1 divided by 2. It's a pentagonal number, if I can put it that way, but the pentagon is just a version of the decagon, right? In other words, it's just the decagon. If you make a decagon, equal-sided decagon, where each side is the same length, then what you're going to get right away, by the way, I erased it already too soon. You're going to get each of the angles around the center is going to be 36 degrees. Yeah. Okay, and the proportions between those 10 little slices of pie, the proportions between the sides of those triangles are going to be variants of the golden section. Right. So to go back to Chuck's more larger point that he made earlier, that there is the mathematical and the reality, right, are really not alternative ideas. But I think the key here that bridges the distinction that I think historically has been made, tended to be made certainly by philosophers, and maybe even by scientists who think that there's a kind of positivistic science that need not be philosophical or ought not to be, right? But the bridge here, I think, is precisely the notion of proportionality, the notion of rationality taken as a ratio that is at one, rationality and proportionality as at once the key and the clue to understanding whether we're understanding verbally or conceptually, or whether we're understanding numerically or geometrically or whatever the case might be. That what is the common element which in effect reduces these two things to different manifestations of the one reality is the notion of a kind of absolute proportionality. So it's interesting. You see, I can talk about the thinking now occurring depending on the context, and I think it's not really alternatives. I can talk about it as absolute. Let me just finish this thought. Absolute proportionality. See, and if we're talking about numbers and letters and that have a numerical value or geometrical form and so on, that's immediately evident, right? But now we've been talking for months and months about absolute particularity, right? Well, wait a minute. If the thinking now occurring can be reduced to absolute particularity and absolute proportionality, then somehow or other, absolute particularity and absolute proportionality ought not to be two different things. They ought to be somehow or other identical things. Do you see? So now so it helps me understand what we are talking about when we talk about absolute particularity. The absolute that the person is an absolute particular. And therefore, in some sense, not necessarily related to others, but as I would say, freely related to others in its very constitution. All right. In other words, it is that I go back to my discontinuous circle of dots. Right. That each dot, each point, as it were, which is now no longer reducible to a nothing, which is a not nothing, which is a kind of existent, analogous at least to the existence that Descartes affirmed when he understood himself to be not nothing, you see, that being, individual, particular, different, being, absolutely different, is nevertheless freely related to all of these other differences, right? It exists in relation to others, right? But does so now freely, you see? And that somehow that's going to bring us to what Augustine has to say about the Trinity, because the paradigm, as it turns out, somewhat surprising to me, as I think I've indicated and trying to indicate here, the paradigm for the logic turns out to be what Augustine says about the Trinity doesn't exhaust what the logic says in all its particulars, but certainly at its most fundamental level, it perfectly coincides the logic, or the logic at its most fundamental level perfectly coincides what Augustine says about the relations between the persons of the Trinity. Okay. You were going to say something?
Well, I just wanted to ask whether everybody is really clear about what the golden section is and what that proportionality is. Because it might be useful to actually...
I almost remember.
Want me to do it one more time?
Just real
No,
quick.
just really what it is. And so it's in terms of... Everybody knows some what?
Oh, I was just going to tell him. Go ahead.
Well, okay, but there are a number of different things. The first thing you have to know is to remember whether in high school you actually got convinced by the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, which was the most kind of the culmination of geometry which most people have forgotten. So that's sort of like the basis of it. The first thing is that you have to understand why the square root of the sum of the squares is the square of the diagonal. The diagonal, you have one, and then the diagonal of a square. And the Pythagorean theorem says that the length of the diagonal is the square root of the sum of the squares. So 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 1 is 1. Add those together and you get 2. And so the square root of 2 is the diagonal. So even if you don't go through the Pythagorean, if you have that on faith, that's the first thing you know. So then the Greeks said, all right, now let's take an oblong that's 1 by 2. And if you do that, it's got to come out the square root of 5, because it's 1. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 1 plus 4 is 5, so the square root of 5. Then if you make a circle with one radius is that, however the length of that one is, and you bring that up to here, and then you take this one as another radius, and you bring it up to here, and you have two new lengths. And those two lengths will create a new shaped rectangle. And the proportions of the internal proportions of that rectangle, that's what this square root of 5 plus 1 over 2 is, by the same rules. And that gives you this diagonal.
That would be the long edge of that triangle.
Yeah.
Of that rectangle.
Of that rectangle, yeah. That now gives you a rectangle that has all the properties of the golden section that you know, that if you divide it at exactly the point where the diagonal taken as a radius interacts, I mean not the diagonal, the one side interacts with the other, you'll get another rectangle which has the same proportions as the original one, and that will happen to infinity. And it's the ratio of the diagonal to the side of that's this number 5. That's 1.6 whatever it is. That's that number that stands for the golden section. And that is the number which, when you perform certain properties to it, gives you the Fibonacci series. So the issue of the Fibonacci series, the 1 plus 1 equal plus 2, that series that you know, its relationship to the golden section is based on, ultimately, the Pythagorean theorem and the internal geometry of diagonals to angles. So it all has a geometrical basis, really, rather than an arithmetical basis. It's a set of ratios that have to do with geometrical properties, but of the simplest kind, and of that rather complicated proof of a very simple property, which was the property that basically screwed up the Pythagoreans and created the tension within the entire history of this issue. I mean, there's an aspect of you could do a whole history of thought, which is reflection on rationality. The word ratio, the word logos, ratio translates logos, and it means all of these different things. A ratio is also a word. Rationality is in the Latin language and in the Greek language coincident with proportionality. And so, in a sense, what David is doing is giving a kind of trumping that entire history.
I was going to say, I mean, what I do here with the Hebrew and the Greek is to kind of prove that that is true in a sense that you would not imagine, right? That the language, the word is a ratio or a set of ratios.
Page 299 is where he defines it and goes into it. And if you want to go back and look at it later about the golden mean.
Okay, and just taking one step further where Chuck left off, we did say last time that this ratio gets the label golden section, because then it becomes that point in a line where if the division is made at that point, you can, without making a further second division, you can create a perfect geometric proportion. So the whole line is to the larger segment, as the larger segment is to the smaller segment, having only made one cut in the line. Whereas in a geometric proportion, 8 is to 4 is 4 is to 2, I cut the line twice. I cut it at 4 and I cut it at 2, right? So it has that unique economy, right? It is the most economical ratio or division short of unity, right? I mean, so it has about it a certain kind of quality of unity, like these numbers do, right? In a certain way. And by the way, 82944, not immediately and evidently so, but it is ultimately intelligible in terms of the golden section. Okay. All right, so after several years, it was discovered that the logic was, in fact, the ground of the Fibonacci sequence, something that we've covered officially, but we may want to look at it more closely at some point. The foundational template of the geometric and arithmetic series. Now, that's something we did cover fairly explicitly, especially when I gave you that handout with the certainly the geometric aspect of that, the what I call the infinitely expanding triangle, and the basis for a deeper understanding of the rationality of structural rigidity, which is what we're doing today. While the writer had, of course, noticed, as anyone might, the analogy between the trinary logic and the Trinity, and had thought it was a most appropriate analogy in the context of the thinking now occurring for the first time, implicitly because of its incarnational root, right? He did not at first take any further serious notice of the analogy. After all, there are threes everywhere. However, in the fall of 1992, while teaching graduate course Christian literature at New York University, the writer discovered that the analogy is not at all incidental. He discovered that, in fact, the complex of relations which exists among the elements in this logic, where different terms can be differently related, but it is not possible to express inequality, which is something I've said earlier in the text, and this note takes us back to that. Actually, it was said by a friend of mine who just said it one day off the bat. I thought it was a rather succinct summary of some of the things we were talking about earlier with Chuck about difference, but difference not here implying or allowing for any kind of inequality, right? So that is a property of the logic which it shares with the doctrine of the Trinity as it's elaborated here by Augustine. Corresponds exactly to the complex of relation which Augustine understood to exist among the three persons of the Godhead, as he worked them out over many years in his De Trinitate. So completely and precisely does the logic correspond to the Augustinian understanding of the Trinitarian relations that it is possible to superimpose the logical terms upon the divine names in such a way that what Augustine concludes in each instance concerning the Trinitarian relations perfectly coincides what is now, for the first time in history, the universal logic of a new world. So I think I said to you many months ago that when I was teaching this course at NYU, of course I'm preparing class, and I'm reading the text. And all of a sudden I just kind of began, kind of noticed something funny here. So I think I must have done it initially in pencil, because I'd been wrong, right? Just started filling in some zeros and unums and ones to see what, whether what I suspected was correct, and that happened. So what I've done here now is I put a permanent superimposition upon poor Augustine's text here, and what I've done here, speaking of selections from Peirce, just selected it may not be an exhaustive selection, but it's a representative selection of, more or less exhaustive, not perfectly so, of passages from the De Trinitate which exemplify what I'm saying. I think it's interesting. I don't think it's an accident that the first one I selected is from Book 6, which tells you that it was ways. If you read Augustine, he's also a discovery type thinker. That is, Augustine's texts don't start out with the answer. They are explorations of a problem or a theme or whatever the case might be. And so it's only as he gets well into his text on the De Trinitate that he begins to get some notion of what the answer to his question is going to be. And it gradually develops and, as it were, evolves. Right? So the early part of the De Trinitate, Augustine is looking around in the most obvious way. Now here's where we would part company in principle with Augustine. Maybe not altogether in principle, okay? But because I think he's in spirit, not in spirit, let's put it that way. Because Augustine is the guy who said, if we could only get inside the body, we would discover this absolutely beautiful proportionality of the body, including what we might consider the most unseemly portions of the body, like the small intestine and stuff like that. Okay, he said no, it's got to be beautiful all the way through. We're just not able here in whatever it is, 400 AD. We can't do that. We can't. But now, of course, we're now in a position to prove it out in depth, right? Anyway, what I was going to say was, on the other hand, there is a difference between the thinking now occurring in Augustine in principle, and speaking philosophically, the difference is that Augustine's attitude is to withdraw from the world of our fleshly experience. Now, I have to be very careful here. He is, although he had a Neoplatonic formation, all right, intellectual formation, which, by the way, he gave himself, right, because he didn't start out as a Neoplatonist, right, but he was a student, he was a philosopher, he was a thinker, and the penultimate step in his approach to Christianity, historically for him, was Platonism, what he called Platonism, we might call it Neoplatonism, and that he found, short of his Christian conversion, he found the most intellectually satisfying. Well, a Platonist is in the business, whether he's Plato or Plotinus, in some sense, central to the Platonic notion is some form of withdrawal from, some sort of, I want to say, maybe if I speak in, it's interesting, I want to say this, put it this way, some kind of bracketing, right, of our worldly, fleshly experience, right? And whereas Christianity does not ultimately allow for that. Quite the contrary, right? If there is an incarnation, then even if there is, and this is a little intramural debate with somebody like Tom Altizer, even if there is an ascension into heaven, even if there is a kind of temporary withdrawal, right? The bottom line in Christianity is the second coming, and the second coming entails the resurrection of the body, right? So for better or for worse, the body is going to be reconstituted in some way or other, and the soul and the body are going to be reunited, you see, eternally. Well, that notion, all right, is really inconsistent with the Platonic tendency to dissociate the real from the corporeal, right, to one degree or another, depending on the context. So what I'm saying is that the thinking now occurring understands itself in that sense to be in no sense Platonic or idealistic or Hegelian, you see, despite some superficial similarities, but that in principle the thinking now occurring is saying something like what Augustine says in the City of God about the beauty of the body, right? So that's it. Now that's Augustine speaking as the Christian, right? But Augustine's basic attitude intellectually, and this is reflected in my analysis of Descartes' use of the terms clear and distinct ideas. I root that back in Augustine's notion that we don't think clearly and distinctly because what Augustine wants to say is that our first thinking takes place in the context of our worldly experience, of our carnal, fleshly, external experience, and Augustine says we confuse, right? The more I'm talking about this, the more I'm thinking the phenomenologists, formally at least, owe a lot to Augustine, right? Because Augustine is saying we need to step back, right, and to make the distinction between things that we are confusing. We're confusing ourselves. Again, he doesn't speak that way. We're confusing our mind, our soul. You see, we're confusing it with something corporeal because that's the first place, as it were. The first corporeal objects are the objects in which we first encounter ourselves thinking about, something like that, right? So the soul has to retreat and distinguish itself from its corporeal objects, and once it does that, it recognizes, for Augustine, that it is an eternal something or other, at least in the sense, not in the Aristotelian sense, but in the sense of indestructible, in the Thomistic sense, immaterial and therefore indestructible and everlasting, if you want, in that sense of eternity.
Atemporal. It's atemporal.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
not everlasting.
Well.
Other than everlasting, because
Okay.
everlasting is completely
Okay.
temporally related.
Okay. All right. But nevertheless created. Okay.
Okay.
Created. Not eternal in the Greek sense. Okay. So, all right. So what I was starting to say was, but in the thinking now occurring, what we want to say is that no such retreat, all right, is to be made. Because if we say that the transcendent itself, speaking in a kind of phenomenological concept, the transcendent, right? The transcendent itself is the identity of the person, to say, then the person cannot be separated. The identity of the person cannot be essentially separated from the world, right? Or from experience, if we can put it that way. And in that sense, when I start speaking that way, I'm saying you use the word trumping. I don't know what we were trumping before. Trumping the word as ratio, right? Yeah. But also trumping pragmatism and Aristotle here. Do you say that is that the very identity of the person is experience. The person is its experience, if I can put it that way. Do you say? And so, therefore, the distinction between soul and body in the thinking now occurring, I mean, in one sense, there is no distinction, or depending on the context, I would say probably that's the best way to put it. I mean, truth be told, the soul is identically the body, and the body is the soul, right? So that takes even the unity of substance in an Aristotelian sense. It takes it, as it were, all the way beyond that. Right? It admits it doesn't. There isn't even the possibility in the thinking now occurring for that distinction to operate. So in that sense, at least logically, there's an internal logic to this, right? So when in another context we could talk about the thinking now occurring as the beginning of the resurrection. Now, however startling an idea that might be, scandalous, startling, incredible, whatever, arrogant, meaningless, whatever. I don't. Right?
Heretical.
Speaking as a pure logician, who cares? It fits, right? In other words, it's perfectly consistent, right? That if there is a essential transformation of consciousness, it cannot be something that is going to take place separate from a transformation of the world or a transformation of the body, right? And therefore, the beginning of the resurrection of the body and the thinking now occurring's notion of the identity of soul and body is certainly internally, logically, perfectly consistent and logically, if not ontologically, necessary. Okay, so despite the analog, and I don't think, not in other words, not an accidental, incidental analog, despite the analog of the logic to Augustine's analysis of the relationships among the three persons of the Trinity, despite the real substantive historical relationship between the doctrine of the Trinity and the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring represents an advance in thinking, and in the context in which I'm phrasing it, I could say we have now come to such an advance in thinking, which may begin, let's say, with the faith of Augustine, I mean, speaking in large terms, and maybe taken a step further in the context of the faith of Aquinas in the 13th century. If this is the third step, so to speak, in that large, giant boot kind of stepping through history, at this stage, at this step is the step at which the distinctions operating in Augustine, which have already been narrowed in Aquinas, the distinction between the world of experience and this atemporal soul. Okay, already that has been narrowed in Augustine. Modernity, of course, complicates the issue, but I'm not going to go over that now. Right? If we write ourselves again at this point in history, then that distinction narrowed in Aquinas is overcome altogether in principle in the thinking now occurring. It's something like that. So I want to be clear that it. And so one way of understanding that explicitly in terms of the topic that Augustine is dealing with is that whatever the analogy is, Augustine has no doubt that what I may see as the logic operating in his description of the relationships among the three persons, he has no doubt that this applies only to the Trinity. In other words, he sees, he's gone through an examination of the world of his physical experience. He's gone through an examination, even when he gets to the atemporal nature of the soul that has been able to separate itself from confusing itself with and clearly perceive itself for what it is, namely a mind, right, which is incorporeal in its substance. Even when he gets to that point, and even when he sees in that created soul, mind, for Augustine, as he will see there, an analog which is reflected in one or two of these passages, which I'll point out when we get to it. Even in this most intimate access that he has to a immaterial creature, namely his own soul, even there he will see an analogy to the Trinity. And for Augustine, the analogy is going to be that the mind, for Augustine, is composed of what he now here is attributing to the three persons, the human mind, by analogy, if you want, to the Creator's being. The human mind is composed of three things, fundamentally for Augustine: memory, understanding, and will. Okay, the obvious differences for Augustine are that in the case of the human being, whose mind has this tripartite structure, right? We have one person whose mind has these three aspects, right? Memory. It's so interesting to me that he speaks of memory as, and by the way, that becomes the analog is the Father.
Yeah.
Okay? And if you think of the Father just in, how shall I put it, casual theological terms, the Father would be the powerhouse of the three, right? The Father is the power, right? And the Son is the Logos. The Son is the Word, the understanding in Augustinian terms. And then in Augustinian terms, the analog of will in the Divine Trinity is the Spirit, and will, although I think in everyday English we lose sight of this fact, but if we read Jonathan Edwards, we're clear on it. Willing something is loving something, or loving something is willing something, all right? So the Spirit is the love that exists between the Father and the Son and the Trinity. Analog, the will. But, now go back to the human analog, which is not satisfying to Augustine, right? Although it's the best he can find in his experience of the world, namely his understanding of his own, the substance of his own being, his spiritual being, his being a mind. It's not satisfying. It's not a perfect analogy because what? There's only one person here, right? I don't mean the body now. Right? There's only one mind. There's only one person, and the three aspects of this one person's mind, all right, do not they are not persons. How can I put it that way, right? They are aspects of one person. Whereas in the case of the Trinity, what are aspects of one person are three persons. You see? And as he says in some of the later selections here, one or two of the later selections, or at least one of them, he emphasizes, so much so is this the case, that what would be each separate intellectual function in the human analog is in the divine being the whole mind. Okay, in other words, the Father doesn't have to turn to the Son to say, well, what do I understand again? Right? Or what shall I will, you see? So in other words, the Son both remembers and wills as well as understands, which is his specialty, so to speak, you see, but he does not go outside of himself, you see. So there's no partition. This is one way of understanding what Augustine is trying to steer through here. And it's an analogous problem. It's probably in a certain way, it's at least formally, it's not a different problem than one of the problems that we have here when we talk about differentiation, which is not negation, and differentiation, which is not a which is not oppositional, or a differentiation which is in I think we can say uncritically in worldly terms, which is not a differentiation which is not incompatible with a certain radical independence in being. Do you say? Now, I'm not sure independence, strictly speaking, is a good word to use about the persons in the Trinity, but if you understand the context in which we're talking, they are independent, as it were, in the sense that one does not depend upon the other for being the whole divine being. Right? Okay, well, we'll look at that more closely here. Let's take a look at the first one to get the idea out here. So 6, 8, 9. Since therefore the Father, now of course, obviously I've added these parenthetical logical digits. The Father alone, or the Son alone, or the Spirit alone is just as great as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit together. All right. So he is not to be called threefold in any sense. Now, there's the first indication of what Augustine is, the problem he has linguistically and otherwise to say. What he says threefold in the Latin is triplex. So he wants to say there are three persons who are one God, but he doesn't want to say that, oh, this is also interesting. I want to say this because it's implicit, and sometimes there's a place where it becomes explicit here and there in the logic. The logical digits are 1, 0, and unum, or 1 unum, 0 unum, and 1, depending which way you're running. 1 unum, 0. But notice here, I'm putting a 1 after he, where what he means by he here is God. Okay? Now, so it gets a little bit tricky. That is to say, if I put the logical equations, which I have here, and you'll see them in the logical chapter, 3.1, if 1 equals 0 unum 1, then 1 equals 0 unum 1. In other words, in a certain way, okay, at least as indices go, we have a kind of double use, if I can put it that way, of 1. Right? One appears on both sides of the equation. Do you see? So, but now you see, if you think of what we already know about the logic, that's not really surprising, right? So 1 is 1, 0 is 1, and unum is 1, as he will say about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. We've already said in the logic. And 1. So what I'm getting at is here the logical equivalent of the 1 that equals the 0 unum and 1. In Augustine's text, what he's referring to is the divine being, if you want, the Godhead. Now, if he were a Neoplatonist, as he might have been before his conversion, he would want to place that second one, or that first one, or the one that is alone by itself on one side of the equation. As a Neoplatonist, he would place that one out of reach, right? He would place that over and above, right? Yeah, you see. whereas I don't think I quote it in these particular passages, but he's quite explicit in the larger text of the De Trinitate. I mean, he says it clearly, right, that the Godhead, meaning the one, unqualified, is the three persons. It's not that the three persons emanate or manifest, right, the Godhead. So there are a couple of things. The one of the two ones, if I can put it that way, the one that stands alone, it is, as the equation tries to indicate here, as he's saying in his language, it is these three persons. Add them all together, as it were. And I have to be very careful. I'm speaking too loosely. You see, you can't add them together like they were, right, pieces of things, right? Not adding them together, but taken together. So this is where I was thinking when I was reviewing this section about your focusing on the word with as a good way of understanding what the inverted therefore means, right? The since, you could translate it with. Zero with unum equals one, right? The Father with the Son with the Spirit equals God, right, is what Augustine is saying in the text, right? And whatever that withness is, so this is good, see? So whatever that togetherness is, whatever with there is, it ain't addition of things outside, right, that I add together in order to get a total. It's not a totalizing thing, right? So now, if withness is of the essence of the thinking now occurring, then what I said in a totally different context, again, is consistent, right? That what we don't have in the assertion of an absolute objectivity, which absolute objectivity is the identity of the person, what we cannot have here in principle, because the fundamental relation operating logically and ontologically is withness, we can't even have the possibility of totalization. You see, we can't have the possibility of a totalitarian politics or otherwise. Oh, by the way, I just got in the mail from my publisher, I just got a review that appeared in Theology, must be a British theological journal, by some fellow I never heard of, but maybe in England you would know who he was. Anyway, I had some misgivings about it because he said that faith and philosophy I'm talking about, that it was kind of an Hegelian history. Right? So I forgave him for that slip, but it's an understandable slip because what he did say, which I thought was very perceptive, the really constructive part of his this is a short review, was that what's going on in faith and philosophy is getting beyond the old, and you can see, he didn't go into all the details, but he kind of boiled it down, that this is a philosophy neither of nothing nor of being. Now this goes to the Levinasian notion of otherwise than being, therefore other than being and other than nothing. So he characterized it as a philosophy of beginning, okay, which I thought was right on. And then he says, kind of one of his last ideas is, it would be interesting to explore, which of course the book doesn't do, but we're always tempted, we want this answer. It would be very interesting, he said, what the political implications would be of a philosophy of beginning. You see? Okay. So I thought that was very interesting. I just mentioned it because what was I going to say? Something about politics, I guess, or something about
The witness.
Regime change.
the witness.
Witness.
Yeah, the witness. Yeah. Okay. Oh, totalitarian. That was the connection, right? Yeah. So the totalitarianism that we experienced in the 20th century, you see, was one way I described it in a somewhat hopeful, if not optimistic manner. In a hopeful manner, is that it was the death throes of an exhausted self-consciousness. But that self-consciousness was in principle, inherently, implicitly, always, all along, a totalitarian ontology. Do you see? All right. So in a thinking now occurring where witness is not precludes, in principle, precludes totalization as the route to unity, you see, then this guy's very interesting question, which he doesn't answer, he just throws it out there, you see, is the political implications of this thinking, you see, preclude in principle anything like a repetition of a totalitarian politics or a totalitarian understanding of the relationship among human beings. Okay. But could one write a treatise out of that? Sure. Has one done so? No, I don't think that's been done. I haven't done it. Okay.
Can I say something
Sure.
about the three persons as knowing, loving, and what's the other faculty that the Father is?
Memory.
Memory, yeah. Yeah.
Before I just want to. I keep interrupting myself.
Yeah.
I was just saying. So it always fascinated me how when we came to this computer age, what do we call the power of the computer? Memory. You want a more powerful computer? Get some more memory. That's all. Deep idea. I'm sorry.
Yeah. That you can, that these, I mean, it's a certain way of understanding this Trinitarian thing, is that each represents a whole style of devotion in which the loving, knowing, or observing, say, constitute the total of the religious context. So a person's main devotional characteristic is observation. A person's devotional characteristic is understanding, intellectual, or the person's own devocation is works. That each totally involves the other without separation. So, I mean, there are all kinds of ways of understanding the three in one that makes some kind of sense. That's one side. The other thing I wanted to say is that, in a certain way, once you buy the simple logical premise of non-equality, inequality, the laying on of the superimposition of the three on the Trinitarian exposition in Augustine is just logical. It's sort of just obvious.
Okay.
I mean, it's just what you do here is just obvious. There isn't much
Once
to
it occurs to you,
contemplate.
right.
Yeah. Once you're reading this through, this isn't so difficult to follow this.
No, I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I don't think it is. Yeah, but I wanted just to make. But I want to bring out some of the subtleties that Augustine's dealing with when what the translator calls threefold. He denies that the Trinity is triplex because his Latin for what the Trinity is, which is the last word, I think, or next penultimate, in the penultimate phrase of the last selection, is the Trinity is simplex, right, which we've already anticipated, right? That in Augustine there are two fundamental characteristics of the Godhead. One is immutability, and the other is simplicity. All right. So what he has in mind here is that the divine simplicity, or he would say that all as he says, probably in the same work, but I don't know whether he says it explicitly in his passages. This is the work in which he is at pains to say that we cannot really. One of the reasons language is faced with insuperable difficulties for Augustine when dealing with the Trinity is that in God there can be no distinction between subject and predicate. Right? Now there is no subject, and therefore God is not a subject for Augustine explicitly, and therefore God is not right. There's nothing there to be predicated. It's as it were if we have a predicate that we want to apply to God as if God were a subject. In God, that predicate is what God is. Right? In other words, if you say that God is simple, then Augustine is saying, no. It's not that God is simple. The Godhead is simplicity itself. Right? It is what simplicity is. As I'm saying that, this is interesting. As I'm saying this, just a passing thought. Again, I think of Peirce. Peirce is so good. And that notion of the quality that we never see, the blue, we never see blue. We always see a particular shade of blue or a particular texture of blue. We always see blue in some particular form, you see. Blueness itself is something we can never grasp. So, analogously, for Augustine, you say God is, if you could say that God was blue, which I think is create problems for him, right? But analogously, if you could say that, Augustine would say, no, God is blueness, right? Just say, it's not that God is simple. God is this absolutely ungraspable, pure quality. But there is a hierarchy of qualities in Augustine, right? And the two highest qualities are immutability and simplicity. In the thinking now occurring, what we're saying is what? That holding on to immutability, right, is is unnecessary and inconsistent in the context in which soul and body somehow or other are identical. Right? But the simplicity, but therefore the critique of Augustine would be, intellectual critique now, right, would be that since he must and does characteristically pair immutability and simplicity, his notion of the divine simplicity is somewhat limited. Do you see? That the thinking now occurring, the divine simplicity is absolutely unqualified simplicity, such that for that simplicity, that absolutely unqualified simplicity that is understood to be what the divine being is, mutability is not an issue.
The change doesn't change it.
Yeah, right. That's right.
What you're
Yeah,
saying.
okay. And the analog of that in a more pedestrian form in the thinking now occurring is the notion of the perfect compatibility of identity in general, identity and change. Did you say? Okay. All right. So God is not triplex, not threefold in any sense, and the He there that is not threefold is the Godhead. It's the one on the left-hand side of the equations as I've set them up here. And the next passage. And when he hears that the Father is the only God, let him not separate the Son or the Holy Spirit from him. And here's where I thought of Alia's remark, for with him they are the only God. With him they are also the one God. Because when he hears that the Son is also the only God, it must needs be taken without any separation of the Father and the Holy Spirit. All right? And let him so say one essence, as not to think that one is greater or better or in any respect different from another. All right, so the one essence there would be the analog of this one on the left-hand side of the equation. Each of the three persons is the one essence. Maybe that's actually what he actually says. I said Godhead, but elsewhere in the text, he says it here in effect, but he says it much more boldly elsewhere. The one essence, meaning the divine essence, is the three persons. It's not... Okay. Nevertheless, not himself is the Son. All right. Now here's where the analog of the not and the not comes up. You see, all right. So now we're saying that these three together are the one essence, right? And they are not to be taken as separate entities that could be composed together. You see, or added together, totalized in order to create one essence. Each of them is the one essence, right? Nevertheless, let him not think that the Father himself is the Son and the Holy Spirit, and whatever is said of each in relation to the other. Now that's the key phrase, okay? In other words, the three persons are distinct from one another. They're not separate from one another, but they are not distinct from one another insofar as they have... Each of them has I would say, in the language of thinking now occurring, a particular relationship to the others. The first particular relationship, the Father is that, or I could use a little more. It still doesn't apply in Augustine's mindset, but analogously. The Father has a specific relation, right? But you see, he wouldn't say that because what he wants to say, he is a relation that is different, that is not the relation that the Son is. So Father, Son, and Spirit are the terms that denote the relations as such, and the relations as such are relations to the others. Okay, so notice he says, and whatever else is said of each in relation to the other, all right? So insofar as something is said of God, of one of the persons, insofar as that person is related to the other persons, that is said of that person uniquely. All right. So they're not all. We don't have three fathers. We don't have three sons. We don't have three spirits. We have distinct persons, but where the person, where his the best single word that he can come up with for person is relation. So we have three relations in that are the Godhead. When you say in the Godhead is too much of a container idea. We have three relations that are the Godhead, you see. So there we have, in the language of thinking now occurring, the divine analog, or exemplar maybe, you see, of a notion of a kind of absolute, it's absolute relationship, absolute differentiation, do you see? Insofar as, here's when I come back to the notion of what I'm tempted to call the independence of the persons from one another, right? But in other words, if the person who is distinct from the other two persons is, as he has just finished insisting, the one essence, then whatever one is to make of the distinct relation that this person is, that relation is free of being justified by, through this relation, I'm going to acquire an identity with the one essence. Right? Each of these persons is the one essence. So therefore, the relationship is not one of dependence, is what I'm saying. You see what I'm saying? In that sense, it's a perfectly free. If you say that the incarnation and the manifestation of the Creator in the creation can now be intellectually appreciated in a way that had, but you can see the whole project of the book, the De Trinitate, is an attempt to find in the creation, you see, some insight into the nature of the Creator, and to see reflected in the creation the nature of the Creator, right? So the thinking now occurring is not incompatible with the tendency, the thrust, you see, the fundamental thrust of Augustine to see some, if you pardon the expression, some relationship between the Creator and the creature, some structural, some reflection, you see. What I'm saying is that the thinking now occurring is that point in history in which we can now see, as it were, a perfect reflection of the Creator in the creation, you see. Maybe perfect is too strong a term, but a relatively perfect, right? Certainly see it free of those encumbrances that have existed in that portion of the 2,000 years of Western thinking since the Incarnation, free of those encumbrances that existed prior to the advent of modernity, you see, and maybe able to, as I think I've said in other ways here, are paradoxically able to see the reflection of the Creator in the creation in a way that is free of the encumbrances hitherto existing prior to modernity, and maybe, ironically, paradoxically, thanks to the clearing of the brush undertaken by modernity, right? In other words, so again, it comes back to that kind of twofold attitude the thinking now occurring has toward modern self-consciousness. Modern self-consciousness is the attempt to clarify thought, to get rid of the unnecessary encumbrances, to give a clear understanding. And the fundamental critique of the thinking now occurring of modern self-consciousness is not its attempt to clarify consciousness, right? But its failure from the get-go, or its self-restriction from the get-go, it's starting from itself on that project in such a way as to preclude from the get-go its ultimate success. The perfect or absolute clarification of consciousness is precluded by the starting place of modernity, right? But what I'm saying is that if we eliminate the self-reference in a kind of absolute other consciousness, which might be another way of understanding the thinking now occurring, then we have a clarification more perfect than modernity was able to arrive at, a clarification in which now we can see, because modernity doesn't exist, Descartes does not exist outside of the context of the previous 1,000-year history of Western thought. We now are able to see the reflection which Augustine could see only through a glass darkly. Right? We can now see it head on. We can see it, as it were, directly. Right? So in a sense, you see, what's new, and I always have to keep focusing on this, depending on who you're talking to, if they don't come from an intellectual orientation, What's specific? What's new here is not the incarnation. What is new? This is not a new religion. You see? What's new here is precisely the intellectual understanding. You see, of the incarnation. Now, of course, it's not simply. Now, here's the point: the incarnational point, which makes it a little hairier or more interesting, is that this clarification of perception is not something that happens magically from an eternal vantage point, but it's something that, in fact, has been made possible only in and through the working out of the reality and implications of the reality of the incarnation through time and space. So the fact that it is, and this is a kind of an Augustinian point, as I think I pointed out to you, right? The reason why Augustine says the resurrection of the body is delayed to the end of the world, whereas your soul is saved at the moment of the crucifixion. I mean, at least, if you're with it. Well, then why not my body too? Right? And Augustine says, well, the soul, as Chuck wants to emphasize, is atemporal. So it's perfectly fitting to the nature of the soul that as soon as it's saved, it's saved. I mean, no time is necessary for the soul to be saved. Whereas the body, says Augustine, is a temporal spatial thing, and of course it would be not fitting for the resurrection of the body to take place instantaneously. It takes time. It takes the remaining history of the world to bring us to the point where the resurrection will come about. Now, Augustine is not thinking in terms of the thinking now occurring exactly, you see, but at that point, I think it's deeply consonant with his notion. You see? It's just now to say, well, let's take that a little more seriously. Let's get rid of this distinction between the atemporal, unchangeable nature of the soul, you see, or relatively unchangeable nature of the soul and the body. Then we see that Augustine's basic insight that the resurrection of the body takes place in and through time and space. You see? The thinking now occurring is just a kind of what Augustine would understand as a kind of unanticipatable concretization of that notion. Right? So to speak of the beginning of the resurrection, again, in this sense, I would say, in the spirit of Augustine's spirit, if not the limitations of his Neoplatonic mindset, his intellectual limitations, not his. I don't mean his IQ now. I mean the framework in which he was struggling actually to change and evolve. Is deeply the thinking that the notion of the beginning of the resurrection is taking place here and now in time and space is perfectly consonant with his explanation of why the resurrection of the body takes place at the end of history. Okay? And therefore there's another sense which Altizer would resonate with, that in another sense the thinking now occurring is in some sense the end of history, but it's the essential end of history. Just as there is a new world order, but in the thinking now occurring, it's not incidentally to be said the new world order is to be understood here, is to be thought essentially as an essentially new world order. And if there's an essentially new world order, then we have the notion of, then we have the room, as it were, if that's the right word, we have the intellectual room for the notion of an absolute particularity, of an absolute withness, you see, as the foundation of human relations. Okay? And so the reviewers toss out, be interesting to what the political implications of a philosophy would be, was right on. I mean, it's right on. Right? Okay.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
So what you just outlined there, the Augustine seeing that there was this time and space differentiation between the soul being saved and then, or being resurrected or saved, and then at the end of time, the body being resurrected. That gap that's there.
Right.
Is that in some sense related to what you're saying is the nothing that's not taking place in the logic?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not. I mean, when you, I don't have any question. I'm only hesitating not because I give you the right answer. Yes, it is related to it. But now you're making me think. I want to think. Well, how?
Yeah. Sure.
I'm not sure. I'm thinking that right off the bat.
Right.
But yes, I think it's this way. I have an expression. I think it's in this book someplace, and I think it's in the second half of the book, where I'm always doing a little critique of Heidegger, and he comes up again. I think somewhere in some elaborate footnotes or something like that. And when he comes up, I zero in on the notion of interpretation. Now, interpretation is big in Heidegger, and it's big in 20th century philosophy, hermeneutics, all this jazz, right? Another scandal of thinking now occurring is there's just no place for interpretation. Because if there's a place for interpretation, then there's a place for subjectivity, right? Then there's a place for that means that things are not clear. And I thought we just got through 500 years. We finally achieved the clarification that we've been reaching for, right? So, but the reason I thought of that is that what I say somewhere in the text is that interpretation is the interposition, the positioning in between the object and the mind of nothing. Right? It's the right. It's the if nothing, I mean a nothing that is not nothing, right? In the traditional sense of the word, right. You understand, right? A nothing, as it were, that is taken seriously, is the condition for interpretation. It provides the gap between what I see and what I think I see. Okay, so the identity of the transcendent itself with the person, or the identity of the transcendent itself, which is the person, better, is the corollary of the identity of body and soul, and so the removal, as it were, the leaving behind in the past of the nothing with the self. Right? That's what's new, right? And therefore, the distinction between the immediate salvation of the soul, but the delayed salvation of the body, that the gap provided by the nothing, or by either the implicit or explicit self-consciousness of past thinking, that's left behind.
You've gone so far from where I wanted to make a little comment. Was that the question? It had to do with something I've been thinking about, with thinking now occurring relative to death of God. That in death of God, there seems to be an anti-Trinitarian stance, in the sense that the Father is the Son exclusively.
Right.
That's the specific heresy of Mr. Althusser.
Right. Which he owns up to.
Right. The correlation of that with the Augustinian psychology in this passage would be the displacement of memory. No memory. No.
Yeah.
No.
That's interesting.
Retaining of the past. No retaining of observation. No retaining. Of. Whereas in thinking now occurring, it becomes a clarification of memory, in which memory is put in its place, as it were. But how does that work out with the Father? That was my question: is where does the species of devotion, which is our Father who art in heaven, where does that? How does that work? You see, here we're talking about a practical religious situation rather than the religiosity of the logos, which is pure understanding. In other words, we're dealing with understanding almost entirely. We don't have much to say about spirit. We don't have a lot to say about love, although that comes in as sounds like interpretation to me.
Are you talking about Augustine or
you?
No, I never interpret anything.
Well,
I just say it the way it is.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. But interpretation or not, the question of the Father.
Well, I'm not sure I'm hearing your question right.
This isn't me. This is my understanding. That's all. I'm not. This isn't coming from some bit of mine.
Are you saying why is the Father the memory?
No, I don't think so. I said, how does it fit in?
how
How
does-
does the father to be understood in the context of thinking now occurring? I
Yes,
think.
how is it put in place?
And or memory. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Meaning the past, meaning the thought of the past, meaning the the placement of the past back in the past,
Okay.
which seems to be a theme, putting the past in its place, in which it's not simply overcome in some violent manner. It's the way you write Novitas, for instance,
Right.
is so that the first time one reads it, you don't know what the attitude is as you're going through each thinker. As you think, you read Aristotle, that sounds good until finally you make the move.
Right.
Each thinker seems to be entered into with the same kind of thoroughness as, say, Derrida will enter into in order to deconstruct it, and you have another kind of deconstruction which requires that actual generosity to the past.
Right,
But
absolutely.
it's still a matter of placing it in its place.
Well, my first inclination, which I'm not going to follow, would be to say, well, I don't know about the father in the past, but I'll accept that memory, probably not accidentally, does suggest the past, and so somehow there's, but I would want to say that, and I think that'll bring me to the thinking now occurring, that as I've just said in a different context, the father is, and using my computer analogy, and he I think you can see very concretely that these are not alternatives, that the power of the computer and its ability to remember, these are not alternatives. That is, the past as the matter of power. You see, as the the father is the memory in the sense that it, and this is so your little synopsis of the approach in Novitas Mundi and in general in the thinking now occurring is to not to attack the past, not to deny its validity, not to take it seriously, not at all, right? Take it unseriously.
The thinking now occurring is empowered by the past.
Well, yeah, in a sense, yeah. I'm trying to say something like that. I'm not sure that may be an oversimplified way of putting it, but let's put it this way. Yes, it's not that the past is simply discarded, but it is if we're talking about a clarification of consciousness, right? Then the clarification of consciousness it cannot be de novo. You see, the clarification of consciousness is a clarification of something that in the past was unclear. So that is, it's not just that the past is an empowering of the thinking now occurring. The thinking now occurring is an empowering of the past. Right? It's when you talk about the resurrection of the dead, you're not just talking about the guys hanging around. Paul's right. The guys at the last hour. Some of us will be falling asleep, and some of us won't. When the resurrection comes, says, "Oh, that's so interesting." You see, another support for the thinking now occurring. Right? We don't have to be dead in order to be resurrected. Paul says that. Okay. Now, some of us, he says, are going to be asleep, and some of us are not going to be asleep. All right? So look at the resurrection as the analog here. The resurrection is not just the empowering of the guys who haven't fallen asleep yet, who aren't dead, but it empowers the dead, those who literally are in the past, or whoever happens to be around when the resurrection occurs. Do you see? So I don't see these as alternatives. So memory, in that sense, of the empowering of the past, the bringing to fruition of what the past left to itself, what it aspired to, but for reasons that we have said over and over again, it was intrinsically unable to achieve. The thinking now occurring, therefore, is pro-past, in the sense that, not pro the limitations of the past, but pro the aspirations of the past. You see, it actually is the fulfillment of the past, and in that sense, the empowering of the past. Now, so that does the past part. Now, the power part of that, the Father is what? The Father is the Creator. He may have created through the Word, right? Good theology, through the Word. And as Thomas says, I think the Spirit was the principle of the creation. He makes a distinction between the instrument and the principle, right? But the Father is the Creator, right? So where is the memory? What is the empowerment of the past and the thinking now occurring? Right? It is the giftedness, you see, in which we, the creatures now, have been created with, as it says in one of the later chapters, which we're actually going to get to this time, in the absolute edge, created with an absolute independence, right? So in effect, the Father has created the world. He is in the world, right? Not in the Sabellian heretical sense, just say that he is the Son, right? The Hegelian sense in which the world is the Son and the Father becomes the world, right? But he is in the world in his effect, now for the first time understood with clarity. The Creator is such a really perfect creator, right? That when he creates something, it stands on its own. Right? In other words, it doesn't hang on him. That wouldn't be a very successful creation if I'm trying to make something other than myself, if I can speak in Hegelian language, and I can't do it in Hegel. I can't do it. I can't do it. So I fall back on the fact, right, that the other than myself, well, I can't make something other than myself, really, but that's not so bad because that means there's nothing outside of myself. So I fall back on a kind of absolute self-satisfaction, right? But a creator who wants to create something, now I'm not going to say other than myself, right, other than itself, right, but to create something, I'll speak Monty Python terms, something completely different. See? Right? Something not the creator, but not as a negation of the creator, to go back to the not business. See? If I want to create something that is not the creator, where not is not a hang-up, it's not a, right, perfectly, completely different than I can say, I can't say than me, I can say that I, okay, then I have to create something that is not the creator, but that independence, as it were, I'm not crazy about the language we're inherited, right? But that independence in being, as it were, that the creature now has, if it's a true and complete independence, is effectively, I would say, in the thinking now occurring, certainly, effectively is a form of creating, right? Especially if you go back to the notion that, the Thomistic notion, which I think is well put, but it's implicit in Augustine, it's explicit in Thomas, that every, how does he put it? Every agent creates its likeness in its product. To say so, in a Thomistic sense, I would say that the Father is in the creation, the likeness. Now, the likeness here. Remember, we got the old business about the schema, right? Likeness is now taking on a new meaning. Now we've got a likeness to the Father. The creation, the creature, the world, with us in it, right, is now the likeness of the Father in a non-Thomistic sense and a non-Hegelian sense, in which the likeness is the reality, right? So the likeness, so the reality is, as it were, you see, the perfect product of a perfectly free creator. A creator who absolutely has nothing to gain or lose by creating, whose creation is a perfectly free act. And that is reflected in the absolute independence of persons in their withness with the other, or with others. And the corollary of that is a perfect objectivity. In other words, if my relationship to you is not something by which I need to have in order to be more or less, you say, to be more, to be greater, and so forth, then I can deal with you objectively. I mean, I can deal with you objectively means I'm not dealing with you for my gain. I'm dealing with you in a way that appears to be appropriate way to deal with you. Right? So I guess what the thinking now occurring is saying is that what in previous forms of thought, whether they be political, legal, social, or ontological, what was ideally the case is now actually the case. And so we are empowered to close the circle of the reference to the Father. The thinking now occurring is saying that the creation is really empowered now. And with that empowerment, of course, comes a ratcheting up of the corresponding responsibility. Right? I mean, if we are now empowered in the sense of free, then we are equally, as it were, or equivalently responsible, responsible in a way that's equivalent to this practical. I almost want to call it. It reminds me of some of the chapter headings. This is so interesting. Well, it's kind of it's like the Hegelian ideal realized, right? So I was going to say, it is practically infinite freedom. Infinite freedom qua practice, right? But realized, not ideally, not an ideal. Yeah.
Could you go into one of those examples? Like you said, legal. How the previous ideal is now the case. What was previously?
Well, I mean, I think of Marx, who was closest to this text on this particular point. I think, although maybe some of the Americans that we'll deal with later on, it'll come up again. But Marx is, in a nutshell, what Marx is complaining about is that, yes, there is in the bourgeois democracies, there is what he calls juridical equality. To say equality before the law. But what his radical critique is that there exists no social equality. And what he's trying to bring about through the revolution, or what he anticipates through the revolution, is a social equality. The critique of the thinking now occurring is, when I zero in on Marx, that social equality is in principle out of reach in Marxism, even though it's his ideal, right? It's out of reach because the condition for achieving it is in principle persons as connected to one another in society. Do you see? In other words, I achieve in Marx, and Coletti, I think in the footnote that I quote at some length kind of makes this very, very explicit, I realize myself through others, and others through me. Do you see? So there is a kind of mutual ideal, not, in other words, this is for good purposes. It's not right? But nevertheless, there is a mutual utilization of one another in order to achieve our common ideal, right? And the thinking now occurring wants to get beyond that notion of one person using another even for ideal ends. You see? Because it thinks that in principle that's flawed. So I've always been struck by Kant's comment. Kant was a great guy. I love it. But anybody who's so systematic and rigorous, and so he says, a very famous comment of Kant's is, when he's speaking morally about persons and freedom, he says it's not right. One can never treat others simply as means, says Kant. Simply as means, right? In other words, he doesn't preclude treating others as means. He doesn't preclude using others, but one cannot reduce one's relationship to a matter of means, all right? So the thinking now occurring qua radical is not at all as means. Not at all as means. Simply is not enough. It's too much of a self-restriction. Okay. So back on this page, 631. So then I'm drawing the analogy in the parentheses there, just as Augustine's insisting that qua relatedness of each to the other, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit cannot be collapsed. They're not identical as such, even though in essence they are the one essence. So the three elements of the logic, which I'm analogizing to word, right? The zero in the logic to the word, that is to the logos, to the Son, and unum to the Spirit. And you see that the analog there, we say the unum is the kind of absolute middle, the absolute middle term in the logic, the term that defines, as we said in that little handout, the order in such a way that either it is straightforwardly the middle, or if one of the others is in the middle, it is only so together with the unum, together with the embodiment of middleness, right? So analogously, the unum is and so the Spirit, the gift in the Godhead for Augustine is the unity of Father and Son, the love between them. And again, over against, pragmatism is moving in this direction. the irreducible threeness of Peirce's logic, where he will not allow them, in principle, I mean, because of the structure of first and second and third, they cannot be collapsed into three aspects of one moment, as he understands Hegel's threeness to be collapsible. But nevertheless, you remember we say Peirce says what? As we'll get when we get the handouts again reminded, the thirdness is relative, whereas firstness and secondness are absolutes. So in Peircean language, what Augustine is saying, analogously, is that the Spirit, the third, is an absolute together with the Father and the Son. You see? And the logic of the thinking now occurring is effectively saying the same thing by analogy, right? That the but once you see, but once you get this, and so therefore the interchange, the equations that appear, well, that appeared, yeah, the equations that effectively appear in this paragraph, which are highlighted before it at the bottom of 630, where 1 equals 0 equals unum, right? That is true in Augustinian terms qua essence. To see that they equal each other because each of them is one. Now, if I put it in quasi-mathematical terms, the logical proof of that, so to speak, in the chapter, short proof, is that 0, 0 with 0 equals 1. Unum with unum equals 1. 1 with what does that tell me? That 0, put it in mathematical terms, 0, unum, and 1 are the square root of 1. They're all the square root of 1. Well, if they're all the square root of 1, what is the square root of 1? It's 1. So they all got to be 1.
I thought we were multiplying.
Yeah, you're right. But we do things like that. So,
So
we're not multiplying essentially. In other words, it's the indifference of the logic in its purity, the indifference to the operations of multiplication, division, subtraction, and addition. Its indifference allows it to be employed in one or more of those categories, which it is, by the way, in that Fibonacci application, where I show how both of you multiply the Fibonacci numbers in the appropriate boxes, and or if you add them together, you get, because each of those boxes has a logical label, 0, unum, or 1, you get the results, the mathematics of adding or multiplying give you the same logical result. So, you see what?
Yeah.
Are you with me?
Yeah, so it's sort of prior to
right.
addition.
It's prior to the
and
distinction.
multiplication rather than, I got it.
Yeah,
And
rather
also-
than an absolute alternative to it. Absolutely.
In the material
Yeah.
today, also this meta-identity business of mirror inversion, that there's an identity that is indifferent to inversion or mirror.
Okay. Right.
So
yes.
you have this multiplication
Right.
of identity, but also to opposite identity and upside down identity.
Right.
And,
That's right.
Trying to work on what that possibly could be.
More generally, the logic is understood. Its relationship to mathematics, which comes up pretty quickly in the text, and it's going to come up in spades as we get further into it. Its relationship to mathematics is understood to be prior to mathematics, more foundational, out of the logical indifference to the operations of ordinary mathematics arises, as it were, the possibility of those operations, right? So it's not precluded from being applied in one or more of those ways, but it doesn't. We don't work from the logical operations back to the logic. The logic is more fundamental. So there's a deep anticipation of the golden section. It's understood in the logic, even though they're not the same thing, because if they were to be the same thing, then the logic would have to be somehow or other subject to the rules of mathematics. You see, what's being said is that there is, in principle at least, a clarification, speaking of clarifications, of what in mathematical terms is obscure at certain points. I give an example in that in that set of theorems on the Fibonacci that involves the Fibonacci series, where in calculus, mathematicians, when they need to do factorial 0 for some reason or another, it equals 1. But the point is, that's by convention. I mean, there's no way that in mathematics factorial 0 equals 1. It's a convention to make the answer come out. Okay, so there's a certain obscurity built into the clarity of mathematics. Okay, and whereas in the logic, factorial 0 equals 1. It's not a convention, right? Because
there's no 0 for it to equal.
Well, there's no nothing. The 0 is not.
Yeah,
the 0 is not nothing.
But it would
That's right.
seem that 0 times 0 times 0 ought to be 0.
Well, 0 times 0 times 0 is unum, but it's not a problem because eventually it's 1. But what I have in mind is that 0 unum 1, 0, right? If I multiply 0, if I take a sequence 0 unum 1, 0 unum 1, and now remember the thing is infinite in both directions. But if I just chop it up there, start someplace 0 unum 1, 0, that 0 is in these terms, by analogy to mathematics, it's the product of 0 unum 1. That,
As you're proceeding down the line, these are
Right.
products. These are. You're calling them products.
yeah, that's right. They're products of a multiplication
Yeah.
in mathematical terms.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. So
You-
you may, but you need not apply the mathematical operations to the logical digits, but you will get the logical result. You will get the result based on. Now it gets more complicated than that. Let me just jump ahead in principle, because the principles are more important than some of these mathematical details. In part of our assignment today, where I have that box that I abstracted from the infinite lattice, just of zeros, unums, and ones, 10 by 10 grid, and what I'm saying in that rather short little chapter, I'm giving an example that square, 10 square of 0 unums and ones, which, by the way, if you look at it closely and compare it to the Fibonacci box earlier on, it's the same box without the Fibonacci numbers in it. Okay.
Can we find what page
Okay.
the picture's on? Must be in.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Let's see.
346.
346. Okay.
Those are-
All right. Now this is a box. It's 10 by 10 square, right? And in there, I've just put the logical digits, and the rationale for this particular arrangement of the digits. I don't mean for the sequence of the digits so much as I mean beginning with 1. All right. Why begin with 1 here in terms of the box? Is that it gives me a 1 diagonal, like in the cornerstone.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? So this is an expanded.
Cornerstone.
Do you see? It's an so if you take the first 3 by 3 little box, sub box up in the upper left hand corner, go 3 down, 3 across, you've got the cornerstone. So this is an expansion of the cornerstone from a 3 by 3 box to a 10 by 10 box. Okay. And what I'm saying to you is, what I want to point out to you is that this is the same basic box as the Fibonacci box is. Now, let's see if we can find that quickly. That might be too good to be true. Page 305. So keep your finger on 346. Go back to 305. And then you look in the upper right-hand corner of the boxes with the Fibonacci numbers in them. You'll see it's 1, 0, unum. Do you see it again?
Yeah.
All right. So this is basically the same grid. Now, one thing I discovered, which I hadn't focused on, but remember last time we did that expanding triangle?
Yeah.
This is the same as the expanding triangle, except that it's in a square. It's been set up as a square. But in other words, the second row of the expanding triangle begins, as this one does, with unum. Because in the expanding triangle, the unum is created by 1 times 0 on the top line, gives me unum. And the reason the triangle is triangular is that I place the unum as the product. I moved the second line over. So if you moved each of these if you indented each of the 10 rows, indent them one place as you go down, you would have the edge of the infinitely expanding triangle. Are you with me? You see that? Because it's the same. So these are different. It's the same thing manifesting itself in different contexts. Now, here's what I wanted to say to show you that, unfortunately, I can't oversimplify this, but it all goes back to Alia's question that provokes this. It's not just that the logic is prior to the mathematical operations, and prior to in such a way that it is, as it were, free, able to be, the digits are able to be added together and or multiplied in certain contexts, such as the Fibonacci sequence, all around that box on page 305, by the way, or not all around it, but, after that, in theorem, page 306 and 307, you have examples of the Fibonacci numbers producing that 82944 number, and then under each of those sets on page 306, for example, of Fibonacci numbers in that grid, unum-founded grid, I call it, I give you the coincidence of those mathematics with the logical mathematics, as it were, here multiplication of the logical digits, right? In other words, so it's working, as it were, simultaneously on the logical and the mathematical level, which is a kind of one form of the demonstration that the relationships of the golden section are founded in, you see, the logic. But those are multiplications. If you look over without analyzing it too closely, just visually so you can locate it for you, on page 308, you have the same principle being applied, only notice here the logical digits on top of 308 are being added together. So the indifference of the logic to the mathematical operations does not preclude its relevance to those mathematical operations in particular situations. Now, I already made that point, I'm just reiterating it. Now I want to say it's worse than that. Okay. The worse is, if you go back to this thing on 346, the point of this rather arcane exercise here, beginning on 345, the infinite logical lattice as the direct predictor of rigidity in grids, the key statement that I want to call your attention to is on page 345, on the page previous to the grid, in the paragraph that has the heading predicting the minimum number of braces for rigid squared grids. At the end of the fourth line of that text, let E be added edges, let L, now watch this, be the arithmetic sum of the logical digits in the grid. And then I give an example of what I'm talking about. And I say 1 plus 0 plus unum plus 1 equals 3. Now you say, well, wait a minute, now you're really blurring distinctions there. You understand? Now you understand, by the way, this is the whole point. I'm overstating it. I'm being dramatic, right? But in a way, it is the whole point. In other words, just as analogously, in pragmatism, vagueness, in this sense, I'm using the expression, in pragmatism, vagueness is the whole point. The whole point of pragmatism is that you cannot make an absolutely definitive statement. Otherwise, positively put, the whole point of pragmatism is probability and a general tendency in the right direction. Okay? So, just as vagueness is the whole point, in this sense of the word, of pragmatism, the ability to cross over without even noticing it, to walk through walls, do you see, between the logic and arithmetic, that's the whole point. Right? Now, I mean, it's not such the whole point that there's no distinctions to be made. We just finished making some of them. You see what I mean? But so Augustine, since what triggers all this, Augustine is saying, well, I got three persons here, and as persons related to one another, they're distinct. But of course, the whole point is they're identical, right? So the essence of the person, I can't. Right? Yes, I can make a distinction, but I cannot make how can I put it? a real distinction. I can't make a distinction where I'm choosing one or the other, where I have to choose one or the other. Okay? So if the thinking now occurring in big, broad terms is the overcoming of the self-other logic, the overcoming of the inside-outside logic, you see? It's the overcoming of, it's going back to Little Adam's question about the wall in Israel, the wall in Berlin, wherever the wall is, in principle, in the thinking now occurring, there's no foundation for that wall any longer. There's
So
no-
this is which is it? The
Yeah.
attributive law, or which is the logical law? Basically, what you're saying is no application of parentheses.
Well, I'm not sure why you're. I'm
Well,
not sure why
1
you're
plus
saying
0 plus unum plus 1 is 3, only if you don't put a parentheses around, say, 1 plus 0 equals 1. Because you've got to get the 0 plus.
that. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Saying so. In other words, you're saying there aren't that traditional classical logical law is not there.
No,
Or it's
they're not there
it's-
in this
it's there-
instance.
It's there if you say so. It's only there if you say so.
It's only there if there's a live, breathing person
To put it there.
who puts it there in a quite perfectly particular, specific context.
Okay.
And in this perfectly specific, particular context, it ain't there. Could it be there? Yeah, not in this context.
All right, but it was.
Okay.
I mean, when I'm, see, this is
Yeah.
this
Yeah,
is with me.
yeah, yeah.
I'm saying, no, logic isn't something that I'm. I didn't get it through my genes, but I've worked at it a little.
Okay.
So I just want to know what the relationship is to all the specific traditional aspects of logic. So that's the answer.
I think
you
that's
could
the answer.
take all of these laws, the associative law, commutative law, attributive law, and you say they're there for free. You use them when you need to use them. They're not put in from the beginning as axiomatically, as it were. So
Okay,
that there's a
that's
law
right.
that
Right.
says there's the way in which the associativity or attributivity or commutativity is to be applied.
Well, there is a law in the logic.
Well, they're
It's
not
called, at the title of the logical chapter, it's the law of absolute unity. Okay? But yes, in the sense in which you're using it, these are not laws that exist apart from their application. Might be a way of putting it.
Well, that they're, like in normal logic, you have A parentheses A plus B close parentheses equals A squared plus AB. But here you're saying the parentheses are only there if you.
I might. Well, I'm saying what we. I think I'm saying what we agreed on. In other words, I might have parenthesized, but I would have come up with a different result, which is what you're pointing out. So,
Yeah.
but all I'm saying is that.
But see, you put in a parenthesis. You're taking this as a.
This parenthesis is
No,
a
but you've got a
rhetorical
single
parenthesis.
figure.
Right.
1 plus 0 plus unum plus 1.
Right.
Okay. But since 0 plus 0, how do you get that? It's by assuming that 0 plus unum is 1, right? That's how you get 3.
I think I get it. Well, if I'm hearing you correctly, you suggested if I put a bracket around 1 plus 0.
No, yes, if you
If I put a bracket around 1 plus 0, in the logic I would get unum. Correct? And then it
Yeah.
would be unum plus 1 equals 2.
2. That's right.
Okay.
So I'm saying you actually have them there. You just haven't put them in, and you have them.
But
So
there's no need for me. But the point is.
Yeah.
Remember, I did that thing when I showed you that
No, but
I
the
could
point is that-
I could relate the logical digits in such a way that I could get 2 different results.
Yeah. So this formula is not unique. It isn't uniquely 3.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's just an example.
Well,
I know what you mean. Okay, it's not uniquely 3.
Yeah.
Well, as set up, it is uniquely 3.
because you need it to be 3. It's the logic of desire.
No. No, that's not right. Because it could be bracketed differently.
Yeah.
It could be treated differently. The
Yeah.
same sequence of digits treated differently would produce a different result.
Yes.
So it's treated, and the way it's treated produces a certain result.
Right.
Treated a different way, you get another result.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what I mean.
All right.
In this
So
context, you want it to be 3.
In this you say I want it to be 3.
Well, because that's the
No,
logic
it's
of
not
what this paragraph
Okay,
is doing.
I want it to be 3, but I would rather say that what I want to do is treat the digits in this context in this way. I'm not looking.
Okay,
And
fine.
it turns out to be 3?
Well, in this case, it turns out to be 3, but elsewhere it would turn out to be 27, right? In other words, it's 3 here is a pure example. So I'd rather say that in this context, I want the digits to be treated, however we might want to phrase it verbally, in a purely sequential, additive sense, without any combinations. Right? Yes, that's true. That's true. Anyway, but here was where I was going. But that, I mean, you
Sorry,
raise an
yeah,
interest.
yeah.
No, I mean the question you raise is a valid and interesting question. But
I mean, I'm all for having a logic in which the logic is so much more general than the arithmetic that it
Yeah.
actually represents a profound principle of creativity.
Well, that's
Which
the whole idea, right.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get out of it
Yeah.
how you get there, because I want that too.
what? Because
But
I leave to the. I see what I would say in self-conscious terms. I leave it to the individual, right? But I don't really. I leave it to the context. But
Yeah.
no, wait a minute. Those are not alternatives. We've been saying all along that the person is essentially the context.
Yeah.
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 All right.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the living person.
Yeah.
You see, who
Yeah, but
puts
that-
in the brackets or
that-
not?
so-
But that person
right.
is not acting arbitrarily.
But that changes the nature of textuality too, because
Sure.
clearly this text is ordinarily the whole point of the text.
You can see why interpretation has no meaning here.
because it's already infinitely interpretable.
Well, you could put it that way.
Well, no, you see, you give an interpretation. If you say the interpretation, if your interpretation of interpretation is the imposition of nihil between
Right,
the
right.
object and the subject. But of course, the people who are interested in hermeneutics are interested in rescuing texts from the unicity and to open up their multiplicity. It's not about nihil at all.
Okay.
If you took Wolfson's interest in where everything is interpretation, the whole point of that is not nihilism. The point of that is in this direction.
A multiplicity of meanings, is that what you
Yes,
said?
of course.
Or well, how about an infinite multiplicity of meanings?
Yeah, well, it's going in that direction.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Now, but what I wanted to point out in terms of Alia's earlier question is, regardless of the technical issues that are raised here, which are to the point, very much to the point. Nevertheless, I wanted to point out something much simpler than this. Okay, I don't care for what I was trying to point out is whether it's 2 or 3. If the context were different, it might be 2. All right, in a different context, it would be 2. What I wanted to point out is that when I assign, in effect here, to the logical digits an arithmetic value, in the case of 0 and unum, I'm assigning to them, which becomes clear elsewhere if it isn't explicit here, 0.5. In other words, I'm saying 0 and unum are 1 logically. I know, so that's why I want to make this clear. Or I want to make the 0 and unum treated arithmetically, since it's pretty straightforward. In the logic, 0, you'll pardon me now, 0 with unum, or, speaking arithmetically, 0 plus unum equals 1. So I want to say in the case where 0 plus unum equals 1, then the arithmetic equivalent of that must be 0.5. Each of them equals 0.5. So wait a minute, one could equal 0.6 and the other 0.4. No, because the logic also tells me that 0 plus 0 equals 1 and unum plus unum equals 1. So I don't have much choice here. It's not that this is not complete chaos, right? But in other words, within the context of the logic, there are certain limitations that if I, in this context, employ the logical digits arithmetically and assign to them an arithmetic value consistent with their logical relationship to 1, and knowing what I know about the logic, each of them must equal 0.5. And so what this translates into is 1 plus 0.5 is 1.5 plus 2 plus 1 equals 3. Now here's the astounding thing to me. The astounding thing, all right? So here's this grid of, see, and I'm saying take your grid, give me your grid, any grid you want, superimpose it where it fits on this grid, and then I give you an equation that will tell you how to brace the grid. One of the ingredients in the equation, L, you determine by assigning, by putting in an arithmetic number that you have deduced from the logical digits that are there when you superimpose your grid. In other words, what I'm saying, so I'm not just saying in some broad theoretical, philosophical sense that the logic is the foundation of mathematics. I'm saying it seamlessly translates into a valid mathematical, in this case geometrical, result. In other words, it's a little miracle, just a little one. There's a tiny little miracle, all right? It actually works, is what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, all right? So it's this ability, not in a totally mindless or random way, but following a certain set of rules in certain contexts, right? You can't separate the rule from the context, might be another way of putting it, right? Or the rule is identical. Well, the rule, more technically, I would say the rule is identical with the context, okay? I actually can use the logical grid interpreted in a mathematical way consistent with the underlying logical relationships to produce a valid mathematical geometrical understanding of how to make rigid geometrically the grid. Yeah.
I don't understand the thing about rigidity.
Rigidity in general?
Yeah, why do we care?
Well,
Squares slide all over the place.
yeah, we
No,
care.
it just stands there.
No, they slide.
Not if you lean on it.
This is
Well, if
Buckminster
it's
Fuller.
if you have a cube that is embraced and you lean up against it, if you have a skeletal cube, just a cube,
Skeletal cube.
Yeah, yeah.
You lean up against
Right.
it and fall.
it'll fall over.
You have to brace
And you don't want. Let's say you don't want to fill it in because you want this cube to be big enough to be your back porch. So you've got to brace it so it doesn't fall
How
in.
do you brace it?
Yeah, but why do I care
Because
about
otherwise
this
you build
thing? I'm not understanding.
Why
Well,
are
it's-
you using the rigidity of structure as an illustration?
As an illustration,
Yeah.
As an illustration, it's an illustration of the.
No, listen. If you this is a Buckminster Fuller business. Buckminster Fuller's whole architectural deal was that if you wanted to create maximally rigid structures, you use triangles. You don't use squares. The whole modern architecture is stupid because it's all based on these squares, and so he invents the Fuller domes and all the other
Right.
structures. Okay, so
Because
but there's
triangles are rigid?
because triangles are
Naturally
rigid.
so,
They're
you might
naturally
say.
rigid.
Yeah, because if
They
you
don't
push
slide
on,
over.
Right,
Yeah.
so the braces are triangular.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so the whole point, Fuller is kind of cockamamie when he gets to the level of logic. He claims that there's all of this logical structure, but there isn't. It's not there. You can't find it. It's sort of cuckoo. But you're actually providing in a sense, in the same way as there's the claim that you're providing the basis for these various aspects of number theory. You're also providing the basic logic that underlies these particular architectural or geodesic properties.
Okay, but it goes further, which I think is more in the direction that Ali is looking for, and that is in this chapter, which I recognize is complicated by the fact that I give numerous examples, but I'm only giving the numerous examples to show these examples break down into several different categories. There are polygons, two-dimensional figures that need to be made rigid. The triangle doesn't need to be; it is already rigid, right? But a square, but a cube would need to be, you see. But a tetrahedron,
The tetrahedron is
like the diamond
maximally
shape, that's rigid. That's the 3D equivalent of a triangle. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
what triggers this conceptually? Why would I bother writing this chapter and putting it in this book?
Making us read it.
Well, I'm only making you read it so that you'll get just a question to get a sense. All right. If you read that chapter, which begins on page 319 and following, we don't have to fuss over the details of it, but what I'm pointing out there on part 2, page 319, that there are in the field in which mathematicians explain to themselves, or to you, if you're interested, how to make a 2 or 3-dimensional figure rigid, how to brace it so it doesn't collapse, right? There are formulas for predicting that. On page 319, I point out in the third line, I give you the 2 formulas, one for 2D figures and one for 3D figures. And what I'm saying conceptually in this chapter is that I can, in the context of applying the logic to this problem, right, I can reduce the 2 formulas fundamentally to one formula, right, which in this case is t equals v minus 2, which formula works when I use it once for 2-dimensional polygons and works iteratively when it's repeated. That same formula, that identical formula, helps me understand the bracing structure of a 3D figure. So in other words, it's a simplification or a unification of the distinction of the 2 and 3-dimensional formulas corresponding to a more general claim that's being made here and later on in the text about the infinitely flat structure of the universe. In other words, that the distinction between 2 and 3 dimensions is not a final distinction. So if you're looking at what is the philosophical import of all of this mathematics, all right, the philosophical import is to demonstrate how it is that one formula, one fundamental formula can be employed in place of 2 different formulas for the two different dimensions. I mean, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's basically the idea. Now, the further thought is that when you look at the 3D figures, I don't know whether there's
There's one on 321.
okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, a better one. Some of the flat ones, the fold-ups, are a little clearer. The point I want to make. On page 323, for example, I have a fold-up. A fold-up, in other words, if you were to cut this out, make a copy of it, and cut it out with a scissor, you could actually build the figure. You know, just fold it up, and you would build the figure. So this is a fold-down, really, I suppose you could say. Now, by applying this one formula in place of the 2 formulas, by applying it to 3D figures, if you look at the fold-up on page 323 of this figure, the dodecahedron,
What?
that's just the name of this particular figure, but you're looking at the fold-up form, so I don't know how you would. Dodecahedron is composed of
12 5 ones.
12, 5, 1.
no. Let's see.
Well, that's what you got here. 6.
What do I got?
You've got 12 pentagons, right? Or
No.
12
Let's see.
tetrahedrons.
1, 2.
12 tetrahedrons.
Yeah, 12. No, I think you were right the first time. I got 12 pentagons, right? Is that what I have?
Well, these
12
are,
pentagons.
when they're folded up, they're
Well, no. Before you fold them, the basic figures are
pentagons.
and there are 6 on each side, so to
Right.
speak. Correct?
Right.
So when you fold it up, you get top and bottom. So you get a figure that is composed of 12 pentagons. The problem is that pentagons, as pentagons, are not rigid. Okay. So how do you make a dodecahedron composed of pentagonal faces? How do you make it rigid? You have to brace it. Right? Now, here's the point. You don't need any of these formulas in order to brace it. I mean, common sense, if you finally figure out how to brace. So if you draw, now, you might need them in order not to have unnecessary braces, you know what I mean? But you could probably figure out intuitively how to brace it and get the minimum number, which in this case would be 36. Okay? But the mathematicians are able to predict, because you can have many more complicated figures. You see? How many braces? I mean, if I'm doing an engineering project, I don't know, Bill may speak to this, I don't know, but I mean, I may need to do rather elaborate application of principles like this, right, ahead of time. I'm not gonna do it by trial and error on the job, right? Okay, gotta have the steel forged and shipped to the site and so forth and so on. See, okay, so it has very practical implications. All right, now here's the point. From an intellectual point of view, not only does this one formula apply in both 2 and 3 dimensional structural situations, okay, But what I'm saying beyond that is that it gives I don't know whether I have I have a good example. Yeah. This example on 323 illustrates the difference between the numbered triangles and the lettered triangles, and then you'll notice that there are a couple of, I think there should be 4 blank triangles in there, right? In other words, this gives a rational understanding of the structure, which is not, as it were, visible to the eye. Right? In other words, I put it to you this way, what is the logic? All right, what is the minimum number of, how can I put it, which of these added triangles that you're forming you need to put in to make, is actually making the brace, so to speak, and which of them, in this case 4, are only there as the flip side of the bracing triangle. I call them ETs, empty triangles. In other words, the application of this rule enables you to understand the distinction between the actual number of triangles you need to do the actual bracing, and to distinguish that number from the number of triangles that you'll see, the remainder of which are there purely as the consequence that you made a triangle. So if I have a square, well, a square is not a good example, so I won't use a square, because the square, no. All right, you understand? So in other words, this gives a more thoroughgoing clarification of the actual logic of the rigidity of a rigid structure, that for which there's nothing like that in the existing formulas. There's nothing like that. In addition to the fact that I have to have 2 different formulas. Now, the basic way in which that's done, and then I'll finish with this little externally braced square, to make another philosophical point. The way in which that's done is, well, let's see, what page are we on? We can stay on that page, maybe? Yeah, on that same page. No, all right, here I am. Okay, so look at the top of page 323, and what am I doing there, and in all the other examples? I'm saying that each vertex, each of the corners of any of these figures, so if it's a cube, there are 8 corners, 4 on the top, 4 on the bottom. In mathematical terms, you would say these are points. Okay? So what is a point in the logical geometry? A point is a 0. It looks like the 0 dimension that a point is in mathematics, but here we know it's not nothing. That it isn't nothing. It isn't the mathematical 0. And then I've given a kind of introduction, which I'm skipping over now. I'm taking the points and I'm saying I'm looking at those points as sets of 3. In other words, if the issue for bracing, whether in 2 or 3 dimensions, is ultimately reducible to the triangle, and if the triangular equivalent, the logical equivalent of a triangle, is 3 points, okay? So what I'm saying here is that if I give me a cube, it's got 8 points. So I'm going to set these 8 points up as overlapping sets of 3 points, because that's setting it up as overlapping triangles, logically speaking. If I set it up as overlapping triangles, which I do at the top of the page, right? So 1, 2, 3, 1. The second 1 is what? The closure of the set of 3 that opens with a 1. Then comes a 4. Why is a 4? Because I haven't gotten to the closure of 2 yet. Right? I'm starting a new set of 3 there. But then I get the 2 that closes that set of 3. You follow me? So I got overlapping sets of 3s, overlapping sets of logical triangles, tells me fundamentally how many triangles I have to create on the cube in order for it to be rigid. So again, the logical analysis of what a triangle is, which is to reduce it to 3 logical points, 3 logical zeros, applied gives me immediately the answer as to what is the minimum number of triangles that have to appear in the figure, whatever the figure is, in order to be braced. So it's another, yes, the word application I think would be good, right? But it's another example philosophically of the seamless transition between the logical structure relationships and the mathematical results, and at the same time clarifying those results and deepening the rational appreciation. That is, I mean that literally, the rational, proportional relationship among the resulting triangles. So now I look at the figure and I say, well, there are 36 triangles bracing this dodecahedron, right? But now I know by rational analysis how many of those are the minimally necessary braces, how many of them are there only because they inevitably result as the flip side of the bracing triangle, do you see? And so forth and so on. All right, the last thing, philosophically, I would point out the very simple thing that occurred to me when I was reviewing this passage, this section on page 333. Here you have an example, very simple example, of a square that's rigid. It's rigid because it's externally braced. That square would be page 333. It would be here. The internal version of this is over on page 332 at the top. There's a square that's also rigid because it's got a diagonal line through it. That is, it's got a brace from diagonal to so two triangles. So the internal bracing of a square is two triangles. Right? The external bracing of a square is also two triangles. Right? But now here's the point. This is, I think, the philosophical. I was thinking of this in terms of the idea of this question of absolute particularity, absolute proportionality, the absolute withness. Is that the mathematics of the logic, or the logical mathematics, whatever you want to call it here, provides for counting. In other words, you'll notice there, right above that picture on page 333 of the externally braced square, the formula, the bottom line of the formula, after going through the whole analysis, is T. That's the number of, meaning EOT, edge overlapping, bracing triangles, right, to put it simply, is V minus 2, in this case equals 3. But notice, here's the point. In the case of externally braced triangles, where I would expect, externally braced polygons, using this example, where I would expect 3 triangles, I get 2 triangles and the figure itself. Okay? In the case of externally braced polygons, the figure itself, which I call an EBP, an externally braced polygon, is, now here's the point which I think is philosophically significant, it is the equivalent of a triangle. It is rigid. You say, well, wait a minute, it's not rigid. That's why you're bracing it. Yeah. But this square is as rigid as those triangles. Okay? In other words, if I could, remember the context, if I could, that is, if I were in a different context, and I took this square out of its relationship with these 2 triangles, it would be non-rigid. Yeah. If I could separate transcendence itself from my identity. If I could do that, right, then I would be nothing. Right? If existence and you see, if existence and nothing could be taken apart, there would be a nothing. But it can't be taken apart. So you say, well, what is the significance of all of this stuff to me? Well, depends on what your practical interests are. It would be more or less, right? I agree with you. But there is a deep truth here. Do you see? In other words, in this actual figure, what otherwise would be non-rigid, in this relationship, in this set of relationships, is as rigid as the triangles are if I took them apart. The point is, they don't exist apart in this particular case. Now, this would be a little example, a little token of the fact that none of us exist apart from the world, right? Not to say that we're totally rigid, but totally free. The analog here would be free. That is, free not to collapse, right? Empowered, because this arrangement empowers the square, you see, in a way that would not be if it were standing in isolation. So rigidity, does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So I want to save, I'll do what best I could do to save rigidity.
Artistically, it does. Yeah.
All right. We pushed the clock. So, as usual, we're running a little behind. We'll probably play some catch up, especially if we have questions or if something occurs that's unanswered. But I think we covered. I gave it my main purpose here with the mathematical stuff is to give you the sense of what is the connection. I think we've done some justice to that. In any event, we'll go on next time to the, which may or may not be more soothing. Some words. Is it purse? Purse in the.
Worse.